There are moments in global politics that do not look like moments at all. There is no breaking news banner, no urgent press conference, no triumphant declaration that something has ended. And yet, quietly, without spectacle, something fades out of existence. That is what happened during the Trump administration's pressure campaign against Canada, a strategy built on tariffs, threats, and escalating rhetoric designed to force concessions from one of America's closest allies. Washington expected confrontation, capitulation, or at least visible drama. Instead, it encountered something far less theatrical and far more consequential: institutional patience. The result was not a dramatic collapse, but a slow erosion of leverage, a campaign that continued in language long after it had lost momentum in reality. The Trump worldview treated pressure as a renewable resource. If one tariff didn't work, you added another. If an ally resisted, you raised the stakes. If negotiations stalled, the lack of movement became proof that your opponents feared your resolve. That logic made sense inside a transactional frame. Deal-making, business negotiations, short-term talks where timelines compress decisions and urgency shapes outcomes. But geopolitics is not a boardroom negotiation, and nation-states are not corporate actors. The administration assumed that because Canada depended heavily on the U.S. market, and because the two economies were tightly integrated through supply chains, investment ties, and regulatory links, Ottawa would eventually have no choice but to bend. Proximity, they believed, produced dependency. Dependency produced leverage. Pressure, applied consistently enough, would force compliance. The mistake was not believing that leverage existed. The mistake was misunderstanding how institutions behave when they are placed under sustained pressure. Canada's response did not consist of fiery speeches, theatrical refusals, or symbolic acts of defiance. It did not attempt to match Trump's tone or turn the dispute into a personal contest. Instead, Canadian institutions did what they were designed to do. They absorbed shocks rather than reacting to them. Disputes were moved out of the political spotlight and into procedural spaces: arbitration panels, trade review boards, multilateral committees, regulatory consultations. Timelines stretched, technical consultations multiplied, policies around trade diversification, long discussed but rarely urgent, began to move forward incrementally. None of this was publicly framed as resistance. It was presented as routine governance, the slow administrative work of managing risk. But this quiet approach achieved something powerful. It denied the pressure campaign the emotional and political reaction it needed to escalate. Pressure strategies depend on visible friction. They thrive on panic, backlash, and urgent decisions. When the target refuses to supply that drama, coercion loses its clarity. Canada treated American pressure not as an existential emergency, but as weather, something to be managed, endured, planned around. And by doing so, it created a structural mismatch. Trump's political style depends on visibility: clear winners, public humiliation of opponents, symbolic moments that prove dominance. Canada operates within a dense network of institutions and norms built around caution, consultation, and shared authority. When economic pain hits, it disperses through provinces, ministries, and agencies rather than exploding in a single dramatic confrontation. That difference matters because politics is not shaped simply by how much pain exists, but by how that pain is distributed and perceived. In the United States, tariffs created loud domestic blowback from industries and voters who felt targeted and demanded relief. In Canada, the burden was spread out slowly, managed through layers of bureaucracy, and absorbed as part of a long-term calculation. Time, in this kind of environment, becomes a strategic weapon. Canada made a deliberate choice. Short-term discomfort was acceptable if it prevented long-term precedent. Enduring pressure was safer than rewarding it. And once Canadian institutions discovered that they could live with American pressure without dramatically reorganizing policy around it, the entire strategic logic of the campaign began to unravel. You can threaten again, of course, but a threat that has been endured once carries less psychological force the second time. It becomes background noise rather than leverage. The ending, when it came, was quiet. There was no signing ceremony announcing resolution, no televised moment of concession from either side. Instead, the issue simply drifted downward in Washington's list of priorities. Bureaucracies began to view continued escalation as costly, distracting, and politically uncertain. Other crises demanded attention. Meetings shifted elsewhere. Briefing documents shrank. The pressure campaign did not formally stop. It simply stopped mattering. and governments rarely announce when something stops mattering. Yet the consequences were real. For Canada, the experience produced institutional confidence, not bravado, not triumphalism, but a deeper belief that resilience was possible. For the United States, the lesson was subtler. Pressure against allies was no longer automatic. It now had to be debated internally, justified, weighed against economic and diplomatic costs. Coercion did not disappear, but it became more selective, more hesitant, and less assured. What this episode ultimately reveals is not just a story about Trump or about Canada, but about how power operates in a world of interconnected economies and thick institutional networks. The old assumption was that tighter integration made allies easier to pressure. In reality, integration diffuses consequences. It makes pain spill across borders and bounce back domestically. It gives targeted states more time, more options, and more partners. Meanwhile, allies observing each other gradually adjust. They learn that the way to survive pressure is not to meet force with force, but to dull it through patience, bureaucracy, and diversification. Not defiance, but insulation. This is the deeper tension exposed by the campaign, the clash between performative power and administrative power. Performative power needs drama, reaction, spectacle. Administrative power thrives in routine, obscurity, and the slow grinding of process. When the two confront each other, the louder one burns energy quickly, the quieter one accumulates resilience. Canada did not challenge American authority. It challenged the efficiency of a particular method of exercising it. And that distinction reshapes expectations. Allies no longer assume coercion must be endured as fate, and American policymakers can no longer assume that pressing harder automatically produces movement. In the bigger picture, this quiet episode is a reminder that credibility in modern geopolitics is not measured by how loudly a state threatens others, but by whether those threats reliably produce outcomes. Canada showed that power can be made inefficient without openly opposing it. No grand gestures were required, no dramatic break occurred. Instead, patience, networks, and institutions slowly turned an aggressive tactic into background noise. In a world where crises overlap and attention is finite, strategies that rely on constant escalation inevitably collide with systems built for endurance. And when that happens, leverage tends to expire much faster than patience. The campaign ended not with victory speeches, but with habit. Governments adjusting, expectations recalibrating, and both sides quietly behaving as though something important had changed, even if no one ever officially said so. In the end, what unfolded between Washington and Ottawa is less a story about conflict than about adaptation. Canada did not win by outmuscling the United States, and the United States did not lose in any conventional sense. Instead, both systems revealed their true nature, one driven by spectacle, the other by endurance. As global politics becomes more complex, more institutional, and more interdependent, episodes like this will shape the real boundaries of power. The states that learn to remain calm under pressure, to let noise pass while institutions quietly absorb the shock, will increasingly determine the tempo of international life. The lesson is not that coercion no longer works, but that its limits now arrive earlier and more quietly than many leaders realize. And sometimes the most decisive moves on the world stage are not the ones shouted from podiums, but the ones carried out silently in meeting rooms, long after the headlines have moved on.